perspective is often regarded as a very important aspect in horror games. So much that there are some who decide against or in favor of playing certain games just because they like or dislike certain perspectives. The recent Resident Evil titles even have mods that just change the perspective, and some horror games even offer different ones without any mods, like Resident Evil Village or the indie game Them and Us. But which perspective is the best? Fixed camera angles, third person, or even the first person perspective? Let's find out! Let's start with fixed camera angles, simply because they came first. Back in the late 90s, Capcom decided to make a horror game called
Resident Evil.
or some shit like that. And it took off pretty well, and then it got a few sequels and a bunch of clones, but that's not important. More important was the perspective that was used. Fixed camera angles. And I know that Alone in the Dark was first and basically invented the fixed camera angle, but Resident Evil was the one to make it big, so you don't need to comment that. But feel free to comment something else, for example your favorite color. Anyway, I think most of us are familiar with them, considering that most of you seem to be just as much of a sucker for survival horror games as I am. Basically, you've got the camera somewhere and see the character from the third person. Wait, so fixed camera angle games are third person games as well? It was all a lie. Anyway, it's fixed so the camera doesn't move and you can control it. There are also a few games where the camera moves but you still can't control it, like Dino Crisis and Haunting Ground, but I will count that towards fixed camera angles. Especially those that play these games since the beginning prefer them over anything else, and haters would say that just because of the nostalgia, but I deliver you some proper facts that are totally not just my opinion. Firstly, they are just amazingly cinematic and can look so damn good. Just take a look at how cinematic entering the RPD in Resident Evil 2 looks, or wandering around the streets in Resident Evil 3, or coming up to the private residence in Code Veronica. And those were just 3 examples, and there's so much more. No other perspective manages to be that good looking, and if done well, they could basically use these moments for a movie. They also help to form a sense of scale and can benefit the horror, because the developer knows exactly what you are looking at, so they can just hide and show whatever they want to you. Except for your mom, because she doesn't fit on the screen. Sorry. No, but to be serious, fixed camera angles help to hide and then emphasize enemies, or just order certain things like upcoming areas in a way that's not possible otherwise. And it's great for the overall feel and tension, especially because you don't have the freedom to just look somewhere else. Enemies will surprise you, because you will be forced to see or not see them. You can't hide enemies in first or third person games like they do with the dogs and for example the first Resident Evil. But of course, like with everything, they are not perfect. Except for my channel, that's perfect. Even though a lot of you haven't subscribed yet, even though you watch my videos. So please consider doing that if you want to support me. Thank you. But what I wanted to say was that there are also some downsides to the fixed camera angles. Many new players struggle with the controls and have problems getting used to the fixed camera angles, which is unfortunate, but at the same time no one can really argue that this is not understandable, considering that there were close to no fixed camera angles games since like 2007, and they are only really coming back in the indie game space in the last few years. But fair enough, more experienced players can struggle with those controls too. Therefore, many actually praise them for making the combat feel more dangerous, because you can't properly move, making the horror aspect more effective. But they can ultimately be pretty frustrating as well. Weird control schemes like the modern option in, for example, Resident Evil 0 and Resident Evil Remake are usually even worse. So all that doesn't help to make the perspective more accessible. Apart from that, it's also pretty limited because you can't really use it for fast action or fast enemies in general. For example, the indie game Alisa has some very fast enemies that are basically impossible to hit without auto-aim. And the game doesn't have auto-aim. Considering that it's basically mandatory if a game features any remotely fast-moving enemies, you get a decently frustrating experience. And even with auto, it's still hard because you can't move out of the way and often don't see them properly. So overall, fixed camera angles look great and fit the horror genre very well, because they emphasize the horror and survival, so the survival horror, perfectly, with possibilities to greatly scare the player with very effective jump scares or nicely done scenes that suck you into the world. But they are also not as accessible and flexible as other perspectives and are pretty limited to slower enemies and less action in general. So coming to the third person perspective, and like I said, fixed camera angles are also third person, but I mean just the over the shoulder perspective that is usually referred to as third person. Yeah, you get it. The over the shoulder perspective was basically invented by Capcom with Resident Evil 4. They were really on a wall back then, huh? It's pretty simple, and I believe even more of you will be familiar with them as well, because a lot of games, no matter the genre, use it. Basically, there's a camera behind the character model that points just over the right shoulder. I mean, it could also be the left shoulder, but for some reason no one does that. Some games like the original Resident Evil 4 or Dead Space are very extreme with it and very close to the character model, while for example the recent Resident Evil remakes or the Silent Hill 2 remake allow a bit more freedom and are a bit further back. In general, most people like them, me included, and I think that they usually strike a good balance. And before you ask, I'm talking about the balance between horror and non-horror, so just a playability. I said that fixed camera angle games are usually hard to control because of tank controls, or even worse, and that's obviously not the case for most over-the-shoulder games that just play like modern games with modern controls. And even games like Resident Evil 4 that still have tank controls are a bit more intuitive to new players. But because the hardness of the fixed camera angle games support the horror for some players, one could argue that over-the-shoulder games are less scary, simply because they are able to properly control the game. I mean, it sounds kinda ridiculous, but it's true that the games are less scary because they control better. Apart from that, they are also less scary because you can see way better what's coming than in fixed camera angle games. Most modern games let you literally look around corners. That's simply not possible with any other perspective, where you will need to get into potential danger to see what's there. But although that sounded pretty negative, I just wanted to say that over-the-shoulder games can be pretty damn scary as well, and that these were just some points that can potentially make it less scary. But of course there are some very nice aspects about it as well. Otherwise you wouldn't have a balance, right? Apart from the better controls, they're also more immersive for many players, because you feel more like the character you're playing than when you just see them from like a freaking surveillance camera. There's simply less space between you and the character, and for the most parts you can also only see what the character is able to see, apart from the worlds thing. And in the end, this feeling of being more connected greatly benefits the immersion. Apart from that, an over-the-shoulder camera is also pretty easy to pull off for the developer, because there's simply not a lot to be aware of. In comparison, fixed camera angles need to be done well, because otherwise they look shit and lose all their cinematic value. They are also good for pretty much every type of game, no matter the enemies, action portions or horror parts. Apart from those games with very tight spaces, small corridors or that focus more on stealth. So the over-the-shoulder camera is a bit like an all-rounder that is good for pretty much everything, usually controls great and is liked by most people. Although there are some downsides, especially in terms of the use in horror games. Which is what we are talking about right now. First-person games feel very similar. I mean, it's pretty much the same perspective, just that you're in the head of the character instead of behind. So almost no difference. The controls are usually pretty much the same as well, and tank controls are even less likely than with an over-the-shoulder perspective. You can't look behind or around corners like in third-person games though, but that's actually beneficial to horror games, as it feels more dangerous and the danger feels closer. Apart from that, it eliminates the problems that make the over-the-shoulder camera slightly less ideal for horror games. It's also arguably even more immersive because you're now literally in the shoes of the character instead of behind, while also enhancing the feel of isolation and being more claustrophobic. Especially because first-person horror games often use the strength of being perfect for tight corridors to depict these exact environments, like large sections of Resident Evil 7 and Outlast. So they are only good things, right? No. Well, the problem is that there are many people who suffer from motion sickness, and fast movements from a first-person view don't really play well with that. It can also look weirdly slow and annoying if the FOV is very low, like in Resident Evil 7, or very weird if you crank up the FOV to over 9000, which isn't as much of a problem with third-person games that usually have more room for adjustment before looking weird. I also want to mention that first-person horror games risk being compared to either Call of Duty or PT, depending on how the trailer looks like. So if there are more than 2 guns, it will be called Call of Duty, and if there are no guns, it's a running simulator and a clone of either PT or Outlast. Although that happens with other perspectives too. For example, many fixed camera survival horror games are automatically a Resident Evil clone, and third-person survival horror games are automatically a Resident Evil Remakes clone. It never feels as negative as the comparison that happened with first-person games. But finally answering the question, there's no definitive answer, and people who have seen other videos of mine are probably not surprised, because I said several times that the perspective doesn't matter to me as long as it fits, and that's still the case here. Fixed camera angles can be great, over-the-shoulder games can be great, and the first-person view can be great as well. I don't see the clear advantage with any perspective, although all have their own issues and benefits. but I would argue that fixed camera angles are great for some classic survival horror, first-person games are great for a very scary atmosphere that makes you feel small and vulnerable, and over-the-shoulder games are great for a balance between horror and action that serves both good. But tell me in the comments, what's your favorite perspective and what do you think of my opinion? Also please consider subscribing, liking and sharing if you enjoyed this video. Thank you and see you next time.